Hello, friends, and welcome back to the Fireside Lit Book Club, a quiet, candlelit corner of the internet where we read slowly, think deeply, and speak authentically about our experiences. I'm Lindsay, and I invite you to join me by the fire as we explore the soul of a book, the beauty it reveals, the questions it asks, and the ways it helps us understand life, identity, and meaning just a little more clearly. As many of you might remember, I devoted much of this winter to reading a variety of Greek tragedies, with my reading selection spanning Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Euripides. And now that I'm closing out the season and already looking to my highly anticipated spring reads, I wanted to spend some time reflecting on what I've learned from reading all these Greek tragedies. In total, I read 10 plays, all of which honestly and surprisingly read more easily than even Shakespeare for me. They were highly readable, and though I can't say I absolutely loved all of them, I did feel they were ultimately all worthwhile reads. Part of what made them so readable, I think, is that Greek tragedy seems to be incredibly direct. The language is elevated and poetic, but the emotional stakes are always crystal clear. A terrible decision has been made, a law has been broken, or a boundary of nature or the gods has been crossed, and now we are watching the consequences unfold. There is a kind of moral clarity to these plays that makes them both gripping and unsettling at the same time. So, I don't think I actually ever talked much about my long-term reading goals on the show yet, but basically what I'm trying to do is work my way through the Oxford University reading list, which I actually got from, and I love this guy, booktuber Benjamin McAvoy, Oxford graduate and current host of the Hardcore Literature Book Club. He's been a huge inspiration to me on my own reading journey, but what he and I do is a little different in terms of book club format. His recordings are more like lectures on only the classics, whereas here at Fireside Lit, you'll get a tie-in each and every time to real life, real emotions, and real experiences. And we go broader than just the classics. Because yes, I do believe classic literature is the bedrock of much of civilization, but contemporary literature has its place in the life of any reader as well. So I try to make space here at Fireside Lit for a more inclusive, bookish itinerary. Anyway, kind of took a little bit of a detour there. But again, I'm working my way through the Oxford University reading list, which essentially includes most of the major classic works of the Western world from the time of the ancient Greeks, beginning with, Homer and some of these early playwrights, spanning all the way to Hemingway. And I did a little math recently, some basic counting for as much as I'm good for. Not a math girl, reader girl all the way. But in order to maintain an unrushed, leisurely pace where I'll really be able to absorb and meditate on these works, I'm probably looking at the next 50 years of my life reading these books. Now, could I be wrong? Sure, I could be overshooting, but Benjamin McAvoy actually talks about his experience when he was a student at the university, and he describes how he had to read all of the works on this list in just a few years. And by the time he got his degree, he was completely burnt out and wanted nothing to do with books. My goal is to not have that happen, so I plan to take it slow and essentially intermingle these more challenging, more complex classic reads with lots of contemporary fiction, science, and psychology books, to name just a few other genres I'm interested in. I'm always adding new books to my TBR on Goodreads, so who knows if it's realistically a list I'll ever finish, but I can't deny that it's a fun process selecting these books and ticking them off as I go. In this same vein, a slower reading pace actually mirrors how many of these works were originally encountered, not rushed through, but contemplated. Greek tragedy, after all, was performed publicly during festivals like the City Dionysia in Athens, where audiences would spend entire days watching plays that forced them to reflect on morality, power, justice, and the fragile nature of human life. So, returning to the point of this episode, what I quickly realized in reading multiple plays from Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Euripides alike is that there are a few themes that get continuously recirculated, and these are conviction, fate, and justice. And I think, just from my rudimentary understanding of Greek history and the time in which these tragedies were written, early democracy and the justice system as we know it today were beginning to be shaped and refined. So from the 6th century to 5th century BCE, we have the cradle of the Western legal tradition beginning to take root. And though our more modern systems are probably more heavily based on the Roman tradition of law, the concepts of how a trial should function and the moral philosophy behind it were pulled more directly from the Greeks. In fact, one of the most fascinating things about Greek tragedy is that it was not merely entertainment. These plays were civic and philosophical exercises. They were a way for the community to wrestle collectively with questions of guilt, innocence, moral responsibility, and the limits of human authority. As a result, we see these playwrights demonstrating these systems and principles in their work. In Aeschylus's Euripides, for instance, much of the play centers around a trial for the main character, Orestes, convicting him or vindicating him of the crime of matricide. A lot of the characters in other tragedies take justice into their own hands, although more informally, as is the case with the entire Oresteia, for example, as do the gods, for example with Hippolytus by Euripides. Over and over again, we are presented with the gravity of immoral acts that go against nature and the consequences that follow, with many of those consequences then directly shaping the fate of the characters. And that brings us to another central theme. Is fate predestined or is it chosen? Is it something we have any power to control, or have our lives already been decided for us? If not by God, then perhaps by our choices and the actions we were always going to take, culminating in an unalterable chain of events like dominoes. And I would strongly guess, by the way many of these tragedies read, that the ancient Greeks would not hesitate to say it's the latter. In fact, the Greeks even had a concept for the moment when a character seals their own downfall, hamartia, often translated as tragic flaw, but perhaps better understood as a tragic error in judgment. The characters are rarely purely evil. Instead, they typically make one catastrophic decision, often driven by emotions like pride, anger, loyalty, or a sense of conviction, and that decision sets the entire tragedy in motion. Really, you can construct strong arguments for both fate as predestination or fate as consequence, though I'm more inclined myself to believe that nothing is predetermined and that we have the autonomy and the agency to choose the course of our lives, even in the most limited of situations. You could, on the flip side, say that it makes a lot of sense that the results of our actions are always inevitable. The outcomes aren't something we can outrun. In that sense, yes, one could argue that everything is predetermined. But the counter-argument to this is that we always have the ability to reconsider our decisions before we act on them. And I think that agency is what drives the idea of free will. We see the tension of this in the very first book of the Bible, even, in Genesis, when God gives Adam and Eve the choice to pick the forbidden fruit despite his warning not to. And John Steinbeck goes on to play with the same biblical tension in what is arguably his greatest work ever written, East of Eden. There's the concept that one may be good, that humans have free will and the choice to overcome sin rather than being predestined to it. Steinbeck famously centers this idea around the Hebrew word timshal, translated as thou mayest, suggesting that the power to choose goodness always remains within human reach. So the Greeks were really one of the earliest civilizations to explore what it means to have free will through the lens of fate and what fate actually means, whether it is an extension of free will or whether it is a form of predestination. And when characters in Greek tragedy sealed their fate through the choices they made, they would often act from a strong sense of conviction. Take Sophocles' Antigone as an example. Antigone was the daughter of Oedipus, who had been exiled from his homeland and doomed to wander as a blind, broken man after he unknowingly murdered his biological father and married and slept with his biological mother. Antigone, along with her sister Ismene, stay close to Oedipus' side as he grows old, acting out of a sense of duty but also compassion. When Antigone learns that her brother Polynices was denied a proper burial for attacking the city of Thebes with an outside army, Antigone defies the king's orders and sets out to give her brother a proper burial, as decreed by the gods. She values her own sense of conviction to do what is right, along with natural law and the gods' orders, over any law decreed by man. For this, she is brutally punished, sealed in a cave by the king, Creon, who is outraged that anyone, much less a woman, should defy his orders. Her fate is sealed, after her resolve to do the right thing at all costs, and because Creon's self-righteousness is bolstered by his own power and lack of humility, there's no changing fate once Antigone's choice is made. And in many ways, the tragedy of the play is not simply Antigone's death, but Creon's blindness. His refusal to listen, to reconsider, or to temper power with wisdom ends up destroying his entire household. It is only when it is too late that Creon decides to relent after being cautioned of divine retribution and ruin by a prophet. But Creon gets to the cave too late. Antigone's fate has already been sealed, as has Creon's. Ultimately, we all seal our own fates, acting in the best of circumstances from a deep sense of courage and conviction, and in the worst, out of mere laziness, apathy, carelessness, or even vengeance. As we see in the Oresteia in particular, vengeance never stops with one generation. There is no satisfactory retributive justice that is capable of righting a wrong. Instead, retributive acts bleed into subsequent generations for lifetimes of misery and suffering inflicted on a household. One act of violence invites another and another until someone finally chooses to break the cycle. That, in many ways, is the moral evolution that Aeschylus seems to gesture toward. The movement from endless cycles of violence and vengeance towards something like civic justice and restraint. Our futures, in many cases, are entirely up to us and within our control, based on our ability to make sound decisions that heal and nurture rather than harm and destroy. We are not left unscathed by the evil we do in this world. Call it whatever you want: karma, the biblical law of harvest, dharma, or fate and destiny. These concepts are not vague or merely literary. They are not written of and echoed extensively throughout history just because they sound pretty. There is a very real law in this universe that seems to reinforce the idea in myriad traditions that you reap what you sow. And we see this acted out in real time, or at least in the theater of our minds in Greek tragedy. And maybe that's why these stories have endured for more than 2,000 years. They remind us that fate is rarely some distant cosmic force descending upon us from above. More often, fate is something far closer to home, the long shadow cast by our own choices. The Greeks understood something about human nature that we are still grappling with today. That conviction can be noble, but it can also blind us. That justice can restore order, but vengeance rarely does. And that the smallest decision, made in a single moment, can ripple outward to shape the course of an entire life. And so, when we read Greek tragedy, we are not just witnessing the downfall of kings, queens, and mythic heroes. We are watching, in a heightened and dramatic form, the same moral drama that, in many ways, unfolds in our own lives every day. The choices we make, the values we stand by, the moments when we choose courage over fear or humility over pride. These are the moments that ultimately shape our fate. For anyone on the fence about reading Greek tragedy, if you're not sure whether you'll get anything out of it or if it sounds like it might be too challenging or complicated, I highly encourage you to pick up the work of these early playwrights anyway. They wrote for the masses, and the lessons these plays contain went on to shape 2,000 years of civilization, informing everything from our ideas about justice and law to the way we tell stories about power, pride, and human responsibility. As always, thank you for joining me today at the Fireside Lit Book Club. Until next time, keep reading, keep thinking deeply, and I'll see you again soon by the fire.